not can go wrong. So I would like to welcome all people available and online today to this formal launch event of the activities of the FARI Institute in the Brussels Capital Region that are funded thanks to the NextGen Europe program, the Relance and Resilience Fund, as we all know. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Vice Rector Innovation, Professor Hugo Tienpont from the Vrije Universiteit Brussels.
Dank u wel, Hans. So, good afternoon, excellencies, dames en heren, dear colleagues, dear friends. Exact 1 jaar geleden werden in het kader van het Recovery and Resilience Facility Program van de Europese Commissie contacten gelegd tussen de Brusselse overheden en de 2 grootste universiteiten van Brussel, de Université Libre de Bruxelles en de Vrije Universiteit Brussel. Alle betrokken partijen werkten samen een concreet voorstel uit waarmee zou kunnen bijgedragen worden aan de versnelde digitale transitie die onze maatschappij vandaag ondergaat op sociaal en economisch vlak. En dat voorstel mondde uit in FARI. Het Artificial Intelligence for the Common Good Institute FARI had van bij de start in 2020 de ambitie om reeds bestaande en natuurlijk ook toekomstige AI, data en robotica-expertise in Brussel te verbeteren door een resoluut multidisciplinaire en maatschappelijk verantwoorde benadering van onderzoek naar en innovatie met artificiële intelligentie, en dit zowel binnen als buiten de universiteitsmuren. FARI zou op deze manier een duurzame digitale transformatie van de Brusselse regio optimaal kunnen begeleiden en waar nodig verder versnellen. FARI's ambition is to put AI knowledge and innovation at the service of the public good. Artificial intelligence, data and robotics technologies can be applied to address societal challenges with the Brussels the Brussels region is facing, and in particular challenges in health, well-being, environment, mobility, energy, and media. Challenges in which the public sector and its administrations are continuously expected to play a leading role. And the €10 million budget from the European Recovery Programme will enable FARI and Brussels to develop an institute with the aim to excel on 3 axes: excellence, impact, and cohesion. Excellence in AI and AI-related disciplines from both VUB and ULB have been widely acknowledged and will be further stimulated thanks to new research and innovation programs funded by the Recovery Programme. By developing new tools and novel instruments for public administration, for non-for-profit organizations, as well as for private companies, FARI aims at socio-economic impact with citizen participation playing a very important role. The recovery plan funding will help FARI to develop activities that are complementary to the engagements of its research groups in Wallonia and Flanders. Indeed, ULB research groups are, for example, active in the Walloon Trail initiative, while groups from VUB participate in the Flemish AI plan. And with the help of the NextGen Europe program, FARI can play a conjunctive role between Brussels, Wallonia, and Flanders. What is more, and on a local level, FARI will take up a key role in connecting all stakeholders of the Brussels open innovation ecosystem: companies, academia, public administration, and citizens. We are extremely grateful for the support we received from and the collaboration we have with the Brussels government and administration in the development of the FARI work program. And I'm personally convinced that our research groups from ULB and VUB will collaborate to the best of their abilities to establish FARI as a trusted and leading partner for the Brussels region when it comes to supporting the development of a sustainable and more cohesive digital society. With today's conference, including an expert debate and talks on urban AI, sustainable AI, and the role of Brussels in a European AI strategy, we mark the start of the activities of FARI. I wish all of you a very fruitful discussion this afternoon, a fantastic start of a successful, durable, and impactful collaboration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hugo, for your kind words. And I would also like to give the floor, of course, to the Université Libre de Bruxelles and the Vice Rector of Research and Innovation, Professor Wynsberghe.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, donc chers collègues des universités, cher Hugo et chers représentants du gouvernement fédéral et de la région de Bruxelles. Donc, en fait, je suis au nom à la fois de l'ULB, de la rectrice, donc Aimee. Je suis très, très heureux de participer à ce lancement officiel des activités de FARI, donc au sein du fonds NextGenerationEU, qui permet donc, comme Hugo vient de le préciser, à nos universités de construire un projet pour une intelligence artificielle qui soit vraiment au service des gens, des citoyens et de la région. Et je voudrais d'ailleurs profiter de cette occasion pour souligner le soutien de la région et de ses représentants, René Verhulst, Barbara Trapp, Bernard Clerfari, à ce projet, et les en remercier chaleureusement, et remercier aussi Noveris et le Centre d'informatique de la région bruxelloise pour leur appui quotidien. Donc en fait, ce n'est pas vraiment un tout nouveau projet, c'est un projet qui a une histoire qui n'est pas encore très longue, mais donc qui date il y a un peu plus de 2 ans, sous l'impulsion du recteur précédent Yvon Angler et de la rectrice Caroline Powell, qui est née l'idée de créer cet institut de recherche assez particulier et unique en son genre, puisqu'il a tout de suite eu vocation à être interdisciplinaire, donc pour mettre en commun les expertises de différents groupes en fait, qui travaillent en intelligence artificielle, en robotique, en sciences des données, en droit, en sciences sociales, mais avec, je dirais, un objectif commun qui soit d'essayer de mettre tout cela au service du bien commun. Et je pense que c'est vraiment important parce que l'intelligence artificielle par le grand public peut être vue comme quelque chose d'un petit peu effrayant, qui peut susciter un certain nombre de craintes. Et une des ambitions en fait, de ce centre, c'est de montrer comment l'intelligence artificielle peut être mise au service des gens et peut permettre aussi de rencontrer, de relever un certain nombre de défis contemporains, de questions complexes, et de le faire par n'importe comment, de le faire avec toute la rigueur scientifique qu'on peut attendre de chercheurs qui sont baignés quotidiennement dans la vie académique. Et ce n'est pas une collaboration nouvelle. L'ULB et la VUB travaillent depuis 40 ans pratiquement en intelligence artificielle avec des chercheurs et des chercheuses de tout premier plan qui à la fois ont produit de la recherche mais qui ont aussi formé des étudiants qui souhaitent s'engager dans les thématiques dans lesquelles ils ont été formés. Et donc ce projet doit aussi permettre de catalyser un peu toute cette expertise et cette énergie au sein de la région. Et on essaye de défendre aussi l'idée que cette recherche appliquée soit collaborative et que les académiques s'ouvrent, je dirais, à la société et soient capables parfois de travailler dans des univers différents avec de nouveaux partenaires un petit peu en dehors de leur sphère. And just to follow up in English, the ambition of FARI, as it was explained in French, is to demonstrate how artificial intelligence can provide a number of services that are really linked to people's daily life in a way to gain their engagement, in a way to build trust. There's a number of challenges for our society, for our regions, and we really want that FARI can put our university expertise at the service of the citizens, but conversely, that FARI could bring citizens into the loop of how things are co-created. The intention is to grow, of course. The first step this year will be to open the door of the Future Test and Experience Center that is located above the central station, and that will make technologies more understandable, and that will serve the first of our key missions, that is education. But of course, this will lead to follow-up developments. And finally, and I'm well placed to say that, is that the entire COVID-19 crisis has reinforced a sense of urgency of how science can benefit to society, can inform decision-making. And the Institute doesn't aim to focus on that, but we really hope that FARI can become another instrument in the region's setting to act always more efficiently in a diversity of theme to improve the living of its citizens. So In parallel to all of this, researchers will also generate many projects, partnership, and I really invite everyone here to stay tuned on the future developments of FARI. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Gilbert. And after the welcome word of the both university representatives, it is an honor for me to give the floor to the State Secretary of the Digital Agenda, Mr. Mathieu Michel from the Federal Government of Belgium. Monsieur Michel.
Thank you very much, Hans, and I would like to thank Professor Gilbert and Professor Tiampon for the welcome words. That's really inspiring for me. And what I've heard confirm my thought about FARI. I have a confession to make. I've got a crush on FARI and its main objective. Its main motto, AI for the common good. We all know how much digitization, data, algorithms, and of course AI is building our society. How much it builds the world of today and of course the world of tomorrow. And it is really a big challenge for governments to take its place in front of such innovation. And the good balance between technical, legal, and political views is not always easy to build. However, it is essential for the entire society to embrace that challenge and to find a way of giving an adapted framework for the development of the new technology and AI. In that concern, the Smart Nation strategy that I developed for Belgium is focused on 3 pillars: convergence, inclusion, and ambition. Convergence means working together, align different strategies in Belgium and in Europe. And in Belgium, it is what it's happening with TRAIL, the Flanders AI plan, and with you, FARI. We are a complicated country, but it's essential that we can build excellence together. So convergence is really important in that smart nation strategy. Convergence, inclusion, because digitization is for everybody, not only for people who know and understand. We must work on the digital gap, the understandability, the readability. Digitization, that's really important, is for everybody. And ambition. The world is our playing field. We, as Belgium, as European, we must take a bigger place in the new economy, in the research. That's really important. This convergence, inclusion, and ambition. And therefore, we need to take action in infrastructure with 5G, with trust, transparency, governance of the data, but also administration. We must build digital tools who are efficient. We must also build digital skills, competencies, but also research, and also build a strong economy. The uptake in the economy of digitization, the AI, and all those tools. And there is so much to do. And it is essential to converge towards, and it has been said, towards common objectives in Belgium, but also with our European partners. We must aim for excellence through our projects and support our talented people, non-profit organizations, and companies to build innovation for everybody. And the opportunities that bring those kinds of innovation are endless, and you know it even better than me. And those innovations must be considered as tools to build better quality for everyone's life. A framework with a good balance between innovation and privacy must be found. A framework between digitization and democracy. As we speak about AI, we speak about a deep concern for each citizen. AI is deeply connected to the way we can imagine the world of tomorrow. The use of the data and algorithms questions ourselves about transparency, readability, equity, but also about the way decisions are taken. Artificial intelligence, blockchain, cryptocurrency are so many revolutions which cannot live for themselves. They must serve people and they must be understood. I think that we, as government, must build the tools to guarantee the expression of democracy in building the digital world. In that matter, the GDPR was a huge step forward to build trust in innovation. And also in Belgium, the privacy law, the governance of the data, or AI for Belgium, those are some of the actions that we take to ensure a good development of AI. In Belgium, it's important to create synergies, optimize positive effects, and create scalability. I take this opportunity to thank the work of AI for Belgium in bringing people together. It will be essential in the coming months to reinforce its structure and strengthen it to be even more efficient. At the federal level, we have also obtained a budget to develop AI, and you know that the recovery plan pays great attention to digitization and AI. For FARI, for example, it was mentioned a few minutes ago. And also at a European level, some discussions are really fundamental to build a strong and confident digital society. I speak about the Digital Services Act or the Digital Market Act, but also the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, ADAS, and of course, the AI regulation. Belgium is an important actor of those discussions where we work hard to guarantee that digitization is developing its opportunities for the common good, placing the citizen in the heart of our attention. With my administration, digital transformation, and my teams, we are also preparing the Belgian presidency of the Council of Europe, which will take place in 2024. The way every citizen lives in a digital society will be a major concern for me. And to my point of view, it's really what the work of FARI is all about. Building a digital society which reflects the values we all believe in, a digital society for the common good. I wish you success, and I will always be beside you. You have my full support, and I thank you for the invitation, and I wish you a really, really good day.
Thank you, Mr. State Secretary. Michel, thank you for your kind words and indeed your support now and also in the past. And I sure know that we can count on your support in the future, as you have said. This project and the activities of the upcoming 3 years, of course, would never have been there without the support of the Brussels government. And thanks to, let's say, digital media, we now have some recorded testimonials from the Brussels representatives. First, Mr. President Rudy Verhulst, then State Secretary of Innovation, Madame Barbara Tracht, and Minister for Digital Agenda for the Brussels Capital Region, Mr. Bernard Clairfailly, will say a few words for you.
Mesdames, Messieurs, dames en heren, beste allen. Tout d'abord, permettez-moi de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cet événement de lancement de FARI, l'Institut dédié à l'intelligence artificielle pour le bien commun. Je suis particulièrement heureux de voir cette initiative, soutenue de longue date par la région, se développer à Bruxelles. Le fait qu'elle le soit dans le cadre du plan pour la reprise et la résilience est tout à fait symbolique. En effet, FARI se situe à la croisée des chemins entre la recherche et l'innovation et les enjeux sociétaux. Sinds bijna 2 jaar zijn we voor een deel van ons leven overgeschakeld op digitale hulpmiddelen. Zo namen onze kinderen en jongeren plaats voor een scherm om les te blijven volgen. Voor veel werknemers is thuiswerk de norm geworden. De overheidsdiensten waren soms alleen via de computer toegankelijk. Ons sociaal leven is voor een deel gedigitaliseerd. Pourtant, ce tout au numérique n'est certainement pas une fin en soi. La Fondation Roi-Baudouin confirmait en 2020 qu'il existe plusieurs formes d'inégalités numériques auxquelles sont associées des inégalités marquées en fonction du niveau du revenu ou du diplôme. Je pense évidemment aux inégalités d'accès aux technologies numériques, mais aussi aux inégalités relatives aux compétences numériques et enfin aux inégalités liées à l'utilisation des services essentiels. Inégalités qui, une fois encore, touchent particulièrement notre population. We zijn steeds meer afhankelijk van instrumenten, van providers of zelfs algoritmes die we niet helemaal begrijpen. Dat wil ik toch even benadrukken. Velen onder ons hebben het wellicht gehad met de algehele digitalisering waartoe deze crisis ons dwingt. In geen geval mogen we onze collectieve intelligentie overlaten aan artificiële instrumenten. Digitaal, artificiële intelligentie en deep learning zijn één voor één begrippen die we moeten leren doorgronden. À mon sens, c'est là aussi qu'un centre de recherche comme FARI vient apporter une contribution importante à cette réflexion collective et nécessaire à l'échelle de notre société. Les thématiques qui seront abordées lors de cet après-midi, le développement d'une intelligence artificielle ancrée dans la durabilité et un contexte urbain, sont donc plus que jamais pertinentes. Et donc je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous un excellent après-midi et me réjouis de pouvoir prendre connaissance des résultats de vos travaux.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous, dag iedereen. Merci d'abord à toute l'équipe de l'Institut FARI de m'avoir invité à participer à cet événement aujourd'hui. Je suis ravie de commencer l'année en me penchant avec vous sur le rôle de l'intelligence artificielle au service du bien commun. Want dat is waar het bij FARI om draait. Nieuwe innovatieve instrumenten ontwikkelen op basis van data, robotica en artificiële intelligentie. Le tout en vue d'apporter des solutions centrées sur l'humain et l'éthique face aux défis de notre société, qu'ils soient climatiques, sociaux, économiques ou démocratiques. Il est essentiel pour assurer un avenir durable et solidaire que la technologie et l'intelligence artificielle se mettent au service de la démocratie et du bien commun, et ce de manière inclusive, au bénéfice de tous et de toutes, et pas seulement au bénéfice d'une catégorie de population. Avec FARI, je sais que nous nous lançons sur la bonne voie. L'intelligence artificielle est un moyen au service de Bruxelles et de ses habitants. En cela, FARI s'inscrit clairement dans notre nouveau plan régional pour l'innovation qui vise à orienter les moyens de la recherche bruxelloise vers des grands domaines d'innovation stratégique, des domaines comme le climat, l'utilisation optimale des ressources, la mobilité, la santé, l'innovation sociale et l'innovation publique, des technologies comme l'intelligence artificielle sont et devront être des facilitateurs pour mettre en œuvre des innovations dans ces secteurs. Ik ben er dan ook trots op dat FARI een van de Brusselse projecten is die ondersteund worden in het kader van het Nationaal Plan voor Herstel en Veerkracht. FARI zal zo verschillende projecten kunnen ontwikkelen die het digitale en innovatieve Brusselse ecosysteem zullen stimuleren. Ik kijk bijvoorbeeld uit naar de ontwikkeling van de AI Experience Hub met zijn dienstencentrum voor de ontwikkeling van proof of concept of andere prototypes. En tant que secrétaire d'État en charge de la recherche scientifique, mais aussi de la transition économique, le programme de soutien à l'entrepreneuriat dans l'intelligence artificielle pour le bien commun m'intéresse aussi tout particulièrement. Je suis convaincue que les entreprises, les start-up ont tout à gagner à s'intéresser à l'intelligence artificielle pour développer de nouvelles solutions et accélérer la transition écologique. Je m'arrête ici, je ne vais pas passer en revue tous vos projets. Je voudrais juste encore vous souhaiter à vous qui êtes les fervents supporters et supportrices de FARI, vous qui contribuez à son futur succès, d'avoir, comme le disait Jacques Brel, des rêves à n'en plus finir et l'envie furieuse d'en réaliser quelques-uns. Merci pour votre attention, à tous mes meilleurs vœux de succès et à vous, ainsi qu'à FARI, une très belle année 2022. Bedankt voor jullie aandacht en ik wens jullie en FARI veel succes in het nieuwe jaar.
Bonjour, je suis très heureux de pouvoir vous dire quelques mots à l'occasion de ce premier événement de l'Institut FARI. L'intelligence artificielle commence à être dans nos vies et elle va se déployer plus encore dans les années à venir car il y a un potentiel extraordinaire d'amélioration de nos interactions entre nous, mais aussi d'améliorer l'interaction entre les administrations publiques et les citoyens, d'améliorer l'efficacité des services publics, d'améliorer la manière dont on prend en compte les avis des citoyens pour améliorer aussi les services publics. Et donc je suis très heureux que nous ayons en région bruxelloise des chercheurs de qualité exceptionnelle, des académiques remarquables au sein de l'Université libre de Bruxelles et de la Vlaams Universiteit Bruxelles qui nous permettent d'exploiter mieux le potentiel de l'intelligence artificielle. Je suis donc très heureux de pouvoir soutenir ce projet FARI avec 3,6 millions dans les 4 années à venir et 1 million pour des projets très concrets, des projets pilotes sur lesquels on travaille déjà. Le premier projet cherche à exploiter les données disponibles pour améliorer la mise en correspondance des chercheurs et des offreurs d'emploi sur le marché bruxellois au bénéfice du service public bruxellois de l'emploi. Le deuxième projet vise aussi à exploiter les données sur les ventes d'animaux afin de prévenir les ventes illégales d'animaux qui se font au détriment du bien-être animal. Le troisième projet vise à collecter de l'information et améliorer, simplifier les textes administratifs pour en améliorer la compréhension par les citoyens avec notre agence de simplification administrative. Et le quatrième projet pilote vise à définir une stratégie générale d'appropriation du potentiel de l'intelligence artificielle au sein des services publics bruxellois et de développer un plan d'action pour sa mise en œuvre. Je me réjouis donc de cette collaboration nouvelle entre les administrations publiques bruxelloises et les chercheurs du monde académique. C'est une collaboration qui est assez intéressante parce que ce sont deux mondes qui n'ont pas l'habitude de travailler ensemble. Et autant les administrations vont pouvoir s'appuyer sur les connaissances scientifiques et technologiques de nos universitaires, autant ceux-ci pourront déployer avec des cas concrets, des cas pratiques, tout le potentiel de leur recherche scientifique et académique. Et je sais qu'on peut compter, comme je l'ai déjà dit, à l'ULB et à la VUB sur des chercheurs de très haut niveau en comparaison internationale. Donc je suis très confiant dans le travail qui va débuter et je vous souhaite dès lors une conférence intéressante et surtout très fructueuse. Bonne journée.
Thank you to Marius, Hugo, thank you to the State Secretary, Mathieu Michel, and to all the representatives of the government, Rudy Verhulst, Barbara Tracht, and Bernard Clairfeuille. So the goal of today is really to bring renowned experts that I will shortly introduce in and around AI, data, and robotics. The goal of today is really to try to see what does it mean to act for the common good, what does it mean, and how to do it in a local context. We'll start today with Stefaan Verhulst, who will introduce the notion of localism. Then we'll hear also Aimee on the pressing challenge of sustainability in AI and all the complexity, Aimee van Wynsberghe. And then we'll hear Holger talk about the future in Europe and in our larger community. What does it mean to act for the common good in our larger context? This will be followed by a panel discussion with our scientific leads at FARI, Hugues Bersini and Anne Noé. So without further ado, I will briefly introduce the presenters of today. The first presenter, Stefaan Verhulst, is the co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer of the GovLab Governance Laboratory at the New York University. He's also the Editor-in-Chief of Data and Policy, an open access journal by Cambridge University Press. He's also a research director at the MacArthur Research Network, a chair of the Data for Children Collaborative with UNICEF. His expertise and is also focused on the notion of urban AI. This will be the umbrella for all the notions that he will introduce to you. The floor is yours, Stefaan.
Great, thanks so much, Carl. Goedemorgen, bonjour. Good day, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this excellent and exciting launch event of FARI. And as you already mentioned, Carl, I'm indeed the co-founder of GovLab. And for those who don't know GovLab, we are an action research center based here in New York. And our focus is on how do we improve the way we make decisions in the public interest, leveraging new technologies. And obviously one of them involves data, but also AI. And I'm delighted to open up this event by focusing on some of the potentials, but also some of the challenges and how we may go about innovation at the local level using AI and data. And as I mentioned, one of the, let me first focus on this. One of the areas that we are focusing on here at GovLab is, of course, cities. And the reason why we are focusing on cities is because obviously cities are, on the one hand, becoming the place where the majority of our population is living. we can see that there will be a massive increase of people going and moving into cities, but cities also become the hub where most of our societal problems are being addressed, mainly because they are presented, of course, in a scale and also in a depth that requires policymakers to really become smarter about how they go about solving some of those problems. And those problems relate, of course, or anyway, are related to, of course, some of the problems that we currently have with regard to COVID-19, but also with regard to increase in population, housing, transportation, crime, energy, environment, biodiversity, and so on and so on. And so we see that cities are becoming the locus where most of the problems are need to be addressed. And also we see that cities are stepping up and really becoming the hubs of innovation, or the labs of innovation, where new technologies are being tested out in order to address some of those problems. And that's also, from my point of view, the real potential of FARI within the context of Brussels, where we can see where Brussels becomes the laboratory of innovation in a responsible way to start using AI for the common good. Now, of course, when we talk about AI, we talk about a variety of tools, software packages, software data applications, and so on. And I'm not going to go into detail here. Suffice to say is that when we talk about AI, we talk about a diversity of applications. And it's important, especially also to understand what are some of the implications that AI might have. It's important to understand that there is a diversity of applications and tools and technologies involved. And we see indeed a variety of cities that are experimenting in a variety of ways with the use of artificial intelligence to address some of the critical challenges of today's age. And they range from, for instance, using robotics in Atlanta, Georgia, to ultimately transforming transportation, for instance, in Copenhagen, Denmark. But it is important when we start looking at the applications to really focus on a few sectors. And it is obvious that certain sectors have been more inducive to the application of AI. And I think it's important for FARI also to acknowledge that certain sectors and certain problems might be more appropriate to start applying AI. And I think for FARI, it's going to be very important to develop that kind of set of criteria or framework for analyzing when is it appropriate to start using AI and what would be possible use of AI as it relates to addressing certain problems. Let me quickly go to a variety of applications to give you all a flavor of some of the projects here in New York, but also elsewhere that have emerged. And of course, transportation is one sector where AI has been applied widely, and also where there is a lot of potential, quite often because there is a lot of data availability in order to start leveraging it to improve the way we go about transportation. And this is an example here of a project in New York around Vision Zero. As some of you might know, New York still has a massive problem with regard to traffic deaths and traffic accidents. And so when the previous mayor de Blasio entered the administration, a key objective was to lower the traffic deaths to zero, or at least decreasing substantially. And here AI was used to really identify hotspots of certain kinds of traffic accidents, and then experiment and simulate certain kinds of interventions that indeed have led to a decrease in traffic accidents as well. Other example in New York is that still many children are going to school using school buses, but obviously in a city where traffic jams are quite common, quite often that meant that children were arriving late. And so here we used, or the city started using algorithms and AI to really reroute school buses in a way that might be more efficient and effective in how children were moved around as well. This is another tool that has been applied in New York City in order to understand pedestrian access and how we can improve safety of pedestrian transportation, and a variety of other examples as well. Now, other sectors such as housing, which of course is a big concern in most cities, but especially in cities such as New York, where of course the housing stock is limited and the prices and gentrification really pushes out certain kinds of vulnerable groups, it's really important to start using data and AI to also start understanding and even being aware of where gentrification starts to happen and how we can address it. And this is just an example on how AI was used in order to understand what kind of pizzas are being ordered, and if the pizzas, for instance, are an indication of gentrification and the type of pizzas that are being bought based upon alternative data sets. And I think that's another important element, is that you can actually start using alternative data sets in order to generate some insights. Of course, the key question is, of course, is there a causation or correlation? But that's another discussion to be held. Other areas, of course, managing infrastructure and quite often maintenance of infrastructure, which is a big deal in cities. And so this is an example where artificial intelligence is being used in order to identify the quality of pipes in the city and to prevent, of course, including gas pipe, of course, accidents, but also other pipes that might be affected. Energy forecasting is another big area where AI has proven to be very successful, where, for instance, in Vermont, they are using algorithms in order to really manage the supply of energy depending on weather forecasting, so that they are anticipating what the use might be and how we can anticipate the use, so that vulnerable groups are not shut off of certain kinds of resources, such as, for instance, heating. Social care is, of course, another big area where AI can be applied. And this is an example in London, where StreetLink is being used in order to understand, of course, spikes in homeless and how we can start addressing the homelessness crisis in many countries as well, but also public safety. And this is another example where AI has been being used in order to identify risks with regard to the housing stock and how we can start preventing fires, for instance, in a preventative mode. Another example in order to prevent and handle crime is, of course, the shot spotter, where AI and Internet of Things can identify where, for instance, gun violence takes place and how to respond to gun violence accidents in a more faster way. And again, all kinds of complications from a civil liberties and human rights perspective as well, but at least there is a potential. And of course, another example is, for instance, crisis management here, where you can identify, and this is done a lot in US cities, where AI is being used to measure, for instance, and identify lead in water and how that can prevent a public health crisis. Public services are also more and more AI-driven. We all have seen during COVID-19 not only an epidemic, but also a pandemic and also an epidemic as it relates to mental health. And clearly, many of the social services have been inundated by calls, and AI has been a way to screen and also to prevent some of the challenges related to mental health, and again has big objectives as well. Now, AI can also be used to improve engagement, and that's a big area where GovLab works on as well, where we actually can use artificial intelligence to make engagement and consultation better. Quite often we have consultations trying to get input from citizens, and then we get so much input that there is no way to make sense of it. And so artificial intelligence can be used to actually make sense of public input during public consultations, but also we can also activate the use of actually citizens to generate generates data that AI can use, such as, for instance, is being done in Helsinki, where actually cyclists are being paid to collect data on street conditions that then subsequently can be used for monitoring of transportation. Education space, another big area where AI can be used here in New York. Clearly, a big challenge in order to allocate the many high school students and where they might be based. And so an algorithm is being used for the last few years in order to make it more fair. And again, you can argue to what extent there are also challenges in it, but obviously here, those that typically would not come into consideration are now also being used for some of the top lead high schools because of the use of artificial intelligence. And of course, some of the other presenters might also talk about the digital twins and how that allows for changes in urban planning by actually simulating on how you might plan and develop the city moving forward. Now, as already mentioned, these are just a few examples, and I wanted to start this today by just giving a flavor of what's happening around the world, and especially here, of course, some of our experiences also in New York City. But I think for the cities to be really effective in the use of AI, they're really going to have to start developing a frame in order to understand what can AI do and what are the conditions for which AI is an appropriate kind of use. And so here are just a set of conditions that are being proposed. And I think it might be good to also develop those within the context of Brussels on when is actually a project an AI project or an AI relevant project, because otherwise, of course, we are entering technological solutionism and assume that AI can solve everything. And of course, there are a set of conditions, such as, for instance, we need data in order to leverage AI. But also, there has to be some clear pain points where, for instance, resources can be allocated in a better way using AI, or where, for instance, of course, some what we try to automate is already very well kind of procedural established. Now, clearly, I don't want to open this conference by just being nirvana and all is well. There are clear challenges involved in the use of AI, including, for instance, increased challenges with regard to surveillance, but also challenges with regard to bias and discrimination. And that can be both at the individual level, but can also be at the group level, where we actually have more and more group privacy concerns and concerns for particular kind of communities that might be targeted or discriminated against because of quite often the bias in the data or because of the bias in how data has been collected. If you have, for instance, used data for law enforcement and turns out that, of course, most of your data are collected with regard targeting a particular kind of group, then surprise, you will probably have bias against that group entering the artificial intelligence use as well. And so in addition to using our city incubator here at GovLab to actually test out and experiment with a variety of new data and AI projects within cities, we of course also are focusing on how can cities not only become the hubs of innovation as it relates to the application, but how can cities also become hubs of innovation as it relates to AI governance. And from my point of view, quite often AI governance is being discussed at the national, at the international level. But from my point of view, the real interesting developments with regard to AI governance is actually happening at the local level, which is why together with Mona Sloan here, a fellow at GovLab, and myself have coined this AI localism, where we actually see where cities are stepping up and are experimenting with new ways to govern AI. And that relates with a variety of topics. And this is, for instance, the canvas that we are developing, which is the toolbox that cities have to their, that can be used by cities in order to develop a governance approach to AI. And it, of course, relates to principles. And we've seen many cities ranging from Barcelona to Montreal launching a set of principles under which they will develop the applications of data and AI. Same for London, where they recently have developed also a charter in order to steer the use of technologies, including AI. But it also involves increasing AI literacy. I mean, it's very hard to have a discussion about AI for the common good if no one understands or no one is literate in what we can do with AI and what the limitations and challenges are of AI. And so in order to have that kind of public conversation, we need actually to invest in AI literacy, but also for public administrations to be able to understand the potential, you need to also have AI literacy within public administration. And so many cities have stepped up, including New York City, where they actually are working with the libraries in order to establish that kind of AI literacy. But also we can have, for instance, targeted, of course, education opportunities during AI weeks and alike. Other big area is, of course, ensuring transparency. And again, we've seen, for instance, that Helsinki and Amsterdam how they have developed an open AI register, but also an accountability and transparency portal where they actually feature what are the kinds of applications that the city has as it relates to AI, what are the algorithms that are being used, and very important to establish trust. Also, procurement is a big actually governance tool within cities that quite often is ignored as a policy and governance policy tool. But we can also see that more and more changes in procurement can also make changes in how we use AI responsible. And so there are already a whole range of procurement models as it relates to AI that can be used. Key, of course, is going to be engagement. And this has already been indicated also when we talk about the common good, who actually defines the common good. And so obviously it's going to be key to actually leverage engagement with citizens in order to co-create both the applications, but also co-create the governance under which those applications are being developed. And here are a few examples again. One is that we have developed at GovLab called the Data Assembly, which is a citizens' assembly around the reuse of data and the use of AI within New York City, where we're actually leveraging input from citizens in identifying opportunities for the use of AI, but also co-creating the governance structures. Engagement, and that's of course within cities, key is also thinking about where do the assets that can help us identify opportunities for AI is of course engagements with universities, and FARI is a great example on how cities can leverage their connection with local universities in order to make advances, both in the applications and in governance as well. And then, of course, accountability and oversight. We see in many cities the creation of dedicated committees, dedicated task forces that are overseeing the use of algorithms, and in some cases, like in New York City, dedicated positions that actually are targeted to make the use of AI more accountable as well. And again, many other cities are following as well. Now, regulation, we see that many cities are also actually stepping up in developing new regulations, such as, for instance, banning of facial recognition, especially live facial recognition. But also, for instance, a new law here developed in New York was basically regulating the use of AI for job applications, so that there is a clear understanding under which AI is being used for actually screening job applicants, and that there is a clear understanding. Now, clearly, AI localism, as I mentioned, is highly needed when we start using AI applications, quite often because the national level is still lacking quite often in giving guidance on how AI should be implemented. And to a large extent also because AI localism, i.e. the governance of AI, also has benefits because it's a much faster feedback loop, and it also, of course, has a stronger community empowerment. Now, there are also, of course, cons, and the reason why it's not always, of course, good to only have cities governing AI is because you will have massive fragmentation within a country. And the minister already advocated for convergence, which is, of course, a key concern in many places. And of course, if most cities start to develop their own approach, then you will actually have fragmentation and quite often differences and divergence on how we go about this. At the same time, when they are approached as more experimental and really laboratories, I think AI localism has a real opportunity. Now, an example where AI localism recently has stepped up is, of course, here where we are based in New York City, where we helped New York City in developing their AI strategy, which, interesting, not only had an AI governance approach, but also an educational approach. And I think AI strategies are very important, not just to steer the use of AI, but to also create a broader understanding what it is actually about, and to also take stock on what is already happening, so that not assuming that nothing is happening as well. And I think AI strategies, especially also, for instance, for Brussels, could be very important to actually elevate understanding what AI can do, what is already being done, and then develop a set of guidances on establishing a data infrastructure, identifying priority AI applications, and also identifying how this will be governed and what kind of partnerships, including engagements, will be needed. I've been, Carl, I've been going through this in a whirlwind, so I will stop here. But if you want to find out more about AI localism, I give you some examples here where you can find out more. One is our introductory example, but also at GovLab, we've developed a repository at ailocalism.org, where you can find many examples on how cities are stepping up as laboratory of innovations in both the applications, but also, and more importantly, in the governance of AI as it relates to the use for improving people's lives. With that, over to you, Carl.
Thank you very much. And I also have the pleasure of announcing something that I forgot, is that Stefaan is also leading and structuring the future FARI associated think tank called the Data Tank, And so thank you very much, Stefaan, for all these words. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Aimee Wynsberghe. She's the Alexander von Humboldt Professor for Applied Ethics of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Bonn in Germany. She's the co-founder and co-director of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics and the board of the Institute for Accountability in a Digital Age. She has also started her new research lab around sustainability. She's the founding editor for the international peer review journal AI and Ethics. And she's also a member of the European Commission's high-level expert group of AI and is a founding board member of the Netherlands AI Alliance. And finally, she's also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Artificial Intelligence and Humanity. The floor is yours, and the questions will be asked at the end of the 3 presentations. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm starting my timer now, so I will do the best job that I can, trying to stick to the 20 minutes. Thank you so much for the warm welcome and introduction. Also, congratulations to everyone involved with FARI. This is really exciting to hear about the initiative, and I understand how much work goes into not only just an opening or a launch event, but also the establishment of such an institute. So big congratulations from my side. Okay, so, right, sharing my screen. I want to talk today about the topic of sustainability. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I am the Alexander von Humboldt Professor for Applied Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, which means that I approach the technology of artificial intelligence, or the topic of artificial intelligence, through the lens of an ethicist. So I'm looking at how do we actually make any kind of judgment on the technology about whether or not it's good or bad or right or wrong. Now, what I'm trying to do in my recent research is to broaden the scope of AI ethics so that we include this value of sustainability. So what I'll be doing in the next 20 minutes is trying to make an argument for why this value is so crucial and important for us to consider. And I'm focusing on the sustainability of artificial intelligence. So in these 20 minutes, as I said, I will briefly go through some of the canonical AI ethics issues and to show that there is a gap in the work that's been done in the last decades. Then I'd like to get into exploring what does sustainable AI mean? And this is how I've been presenting it in journal articles. Then I want to focus on one sort of aspect of the sustainability issue, which is the ecological footprint. So I will go through some of the environmental consequences that we should be paying attention to. And really to end with this question that I want to put back to the FARI group, when we're talking about AI for the common good, who is the common good, right? Which groups are considered a part of this circle when we're talking about a common good? So I'll briefly touch on that. Okay, so first of all, what is AI ethics? We can say that AI ethics is really looking at uncovering, addressing, and trying to mitigate all of the ethical issues that are related to the technology of artificial intelligence. Now, it's not just the ethical issues related to once we have made the technology, and then we think, oh, maybe we have a problem with privacy. But it's looking at the entire design process. So every moment in the life cycle of the design process, there are different ethical issues, right? We understand that there are issues concerning algorithmic bias. And this is something that has to do at the very early stages of the design of the technology. Then we also understand that there are issues in terms of who has access to the technology, right? So the equitable or the inclusivity of the technology. And this is more related to the later stages of the design process. So there are different ethical issues that reveal themselves at each moment of the design process. And this is what AI ethics is meant to address. It is different than a checklist. Right? So oftentimes we hear about, well, we can have an ethics checklist and then we've done ethics. AI ethics is this critical ongoing process. As we have more experience with the technology, we uncover new ethical issues, or we're able to reprioritize certain ethical issues. So we're starting to really grasp the severity of algorithmic bias these days, because whereas, in the last 5 years, we started to understand it was a problem, but now we're seeing the gravity of this problem. So it's this ongoing critical reflection. Now, the kinds of issues that have been addressed under the umbrella of AI ethics have varied. We've seen, or we've heard many sort of dystopian scenarios, right, where the famous Stephen Hawking warned about artificial intelligence and how it could end mankind. We are familiar in pop culture, at least in the global West. We are, usually thinking of movies like The Terminator or Space Odyssey, where AI is something that will take over and essentially end mankind. So these are some of the earlier ethical issues that were starting to be addressed. Now we see ethicists are focused more on specific applications. So we heard some of in the earlier talk, we heard some of the ethical issues that need to be addressed, especially related to predictive policing or AI in the policing sector at all. There are issues related to, will AI and robotics take your job? This is, of course, a common dystopian, but a common fear that society has about the introduction of this technology. And then we've seen more interesting situations where the use of this technology really challenges us or forces us to kind of rethink some of the ethical concepts that we use on a daily basis. So something like responsibility. When we think about the self-driving Uber and when fatalities happen with a self-driving car, who or what is responsible? So I think even machine learning sort of in general, if we don't understand the rules that are generated by the model, and not just we, but the actual developer doesn't understand, how do we place responsibility? So this is just to show that there's a range, a variety of ethical issues that we have come to learn through the use of artificial intelligence in society. And these issues are forcing us to rethink and reevaluate these canonical ethical concepts that we've been working with for the last however many 100 years. But what I think is really interesting is I've been working in this space for almost 2 decades. And as mentioned, I was on the European Commission high-level expert group. I'm in a variety of civil society organizations. I also work in the private space. I've worked with Deloitte on the topic. And what I've noticed is that there has been quite a great amount of attention towards issues like privacy, bias, fairness, gender discrepancies, so gender diversity and inclusion. And while I think this is absolutely paramount and necessary, we have failed to address a certain large consequence that we are paying attention to in other respects. So we have the European Green Deal. For some reason, the focus on sustainability has not been a part of the AI ethics or the AI discussion to the extent that it needs to be a part of. And I think the reason for this has to do with AI kind of invoking this idea that it is not a physical infrastructure. So this quote comes from the new book by Kate Crawford called Atlas of AI. And here she says, the term AI may invoke ideas of algorithms, data, the cloud architecture, but none of this can function without the minerals and resources that build computing's core components. So really, none of the AI examples that we have heard about or that I was just describing earlier, none of this can function without a physical infrastructure, but we don't necessarily think about that physical infrastructure when we think about the technology and the promise that the technology holds. So for this reason, I think it's time for AI ethicists. I think it's also time for policymakers. It's time for the AI community in general to start to think about what it means to create AI in a sustainable way. So what is sustainable AI? Now, in a recent paper, I've tried to explore this topic in greater detail. And what I did was to create 2 branches. We have, under this umbrella of sustainable AI, we have AI for sustainability, and we can have the sustainability of AI. Now, what's really interesting is the former, AI for sustainability. There's quite a few initiatives in this area, right? So probably the most well-known one is AI for Good, the Global Summit, which is now an annual platform that's held online. This is organized by the United Nations branch, ITU. So there are a variety of initiatives looking at how do we harness the power of AI to help us tackle climate change or to help us address and to speed up the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals or the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And now, while I think that this is, wonderful to think about how we are going to use this technology, at the same time, I do think we need to look at both sides of the coin, if you will. So while there's a growing effort to direct AI usage towards good uses, I do believe that it's time for us to move on beyond this, looking at how we can use it for good uses and to address the actual sustainability of developing and using AI systems in and of themselves. So I mean, the next question might be for people in the audience, well, why do we care about this? I mean, is there really anything, is there anything to worry about? Do we have any research on this? Well, we're starting to actually get some research, and the research is proving to be quite alarming in a certain sense. So what I will do is go through now some of the ecological footprints or some of the environmental consequences, but I of course don't have time to go through all of them. The first one, carbon emissions. Now, again, going back to this idea, when you think of AI, you think of the cloud, you don't imagine that there are such incredible environmental consequences just by creating the model. But a well-known study done by Emma Struble in the United States just a few years ago, she started to uncover that the training of just one single deep learning natural language processing model can lead to approximately 600,000 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions. So then if we think, for many of us, 600 pounds of carbon dioxide emissions doesn't mean so much. But if we compare that to our familiar consumption, our daily sort of language that we would use, we're looking at roughly the same amount of carbon training one algorithm that 5 cars over the lifetime of that car produces in terms of carbon emissions, right? And so this is just the training. There's also something called tuning, when you repurpose the algorithm for a different use or for a different data set, or you expand it for a different application and whatnot. So we have the training, the tuning, the kind of retraining, and then we have the usage. And right now, we only have a very small amount of numbers that tell us a fraction of what we need to know about the total carbon emissions. So with this one model, then think, how many AI companies are actually out there developing and using artificial intelligence? The number of companies and enterprises is growing exponentially each year. Then when we look at revenues from AI for enterprise applications, again, the number is growing at an incredibly fast pace. So it's not just about one algorithm and showing this one number from one algorithm. It's thinking about the entire infrastructure of AI. We've heard about how it can be used in the cities for public services, for private services. What are the carbon emissions that we're actually talking about? The next ecological footprint or environmental consequence to think about is the mining of precious minerals. Now, there are a variety of minerals that are needed in the whole sort of life cycle of AI. You need lithium for batteries, you need cobalt, you need zinc sulfide, you need different minerals for the batteries, then for the servers, the processors, and so on and so forth. And what's really interesting is that currently, many of these minerals are now being referred to as blood minerals, in the same way that we used to refer to blood diamonds, because of the slave-like conditions that these individuals have to work in. So we're talking about the requirement of these minerals for the AI infrastructure, and the fact that these minerals are sourced in a way where people are exploited. Not only the environment is exploited, but people are exploited so that we can power this AI infrastructure. And going back to another quote by Kate Crawford, since antiquity, the business of mining has only been profitable because it does not have to account for its true costs, including environmental damage, the illness and death to miners, and the loss to the communities it displaces. So again, going back to this idea, we have to remember that this wonderful technology that we hear all about is not existing in a quote unquote cloud. There's a physical infrastructure. The environment is exploited in order to make this physical infrastructure, as are certain communities and demographics on this planet. The last environmental consequence that I want to touch on is that of electronic waste, e-waste, right? Now, oftentimes electronic waste is shipped from Europe, from the United States to countries in Asia, to the continent of Africa, because it's easier to ship them to these countries and to dump them there, to dump the problem there, because they have lower environmental standards. Now, much of the electronic waste contains toxins. And so when individuals have to dismantle the keyboards, for example, or dismantle the smartphones, they are exposed to these toxins. This puts them at health risks. There are health hazards to this. Moving beyond that, not only is it aesthetically not pleasing to look at, but also all of the electronic waste that you see there, the toxins in that waste will seep into the ground, into the soil, contaminating the water and contaminating the entire agricultural infrastructure. So we're creating health hazards for the individuals who are dismantling the products, and we're also creating health hazards for the communities that have to live with the electronic waste that is piling up around them. So these are essentially issues of environmental justice, right? We're talking about a range of ethical issues that are not usually in the principles and whatnot that we hear most often. So going back to the starting point of today, or you know, the original question, AI for the common good, who is included into this notion of common goods, right? And so I posed that question to the FARI group. I imagine, of course, you're at the very early stages, but I would be curious to see how the research unfolds to account for this concept of common good and who it is that is included. The reason why I say that is because we just heard a bunch of examples about AI being used in the city, and there were parents who could get their children to school on time, right? Because the school buses could avoid traffic. So that's, you know, that's one interesting application where we can see a small subset of the population is benefiting from that. But then at what cost? And we can see that coastal regions are the ones who are suffering most significantly from the fluctuating environmental changes that are unpredictable. We see the continents and the countries that are suffering because of the plastics and electronic waste that are shipped from the global west to the global south often. And we see the conditions that large communities of individuals have to suffer through by working in the mining communities that are required in order to, yes, power this technology that we're talking about. So I asked then, who is included in this notion of common good? Because there are certain communities, like the ones that you see on your screen here, who are suffering immediate and urgently from the climate crisis. But I also want to say that it's not just these communities who are suffering as a part of, you know, the climate crisis and AI's role in the climate crisis. It's also the global community. And I'm certainly not the first one to raise environmental issues, but the IPCC has very recently said that this is code red for humanity, right? The fact that we need to address our consumption practices. So it's, again, going back to this idea, it's not just about using it for a certain kind of application, it's really reevaluating our consumption practices. And so to account for this, I suggest that in terms of policy, we must start to measure carbon emissions. It should be required for companies to have to measure, to track, and to be transparent about the kind of carbon emissions that they encounter when they are training, tuning, and using artificial intelligence. We should also start to track electricity consumption. We should have an idea of the water usage and the land usage. And we should be looking into, again, the precious minerals that are used in this process and how we can avoid the hidden slave-like labor conditions for this chain of labor. So wrapping up then, AI development and use causes environmental damage. I hope that that message was clear and brought to the fore. I am suggesting that it is imminent to focus on sustainable artificial intelligence as a new area of AI ethics. I think that attention to sustainability of AI actually uncovers hidden costs and demographics who are suffering. So when we put environmental consequences at the center point of our ethical evaluation, it forces us to recognize that there are people in the global community, people who are part of the common good, who are suffering much more than others because of our wish to have artificial intelligence. And I believe that now it's time we need to include environmental costs in future AI regulation. Thank you very much for your attention. Carl, I made it with 2 minutes to spare. And yeah, I look forward to the questions later.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this really wonderful talk. I also put in the chat the link to your lab, as well as Stefan's link to the GovLab. So now it is my pleasure to invite Professor Holger Verhulst. Professor Holger Verhulst is another Alexander von Humboldt Professor for Artificial Intelligence at Aachen University and Professor of Machine Learning at Leiden University. He's the co-founder and chair of the board of the Confederation of Laboratories for Artificial Intelligence Research in Europe, CLAIRE, in which FARI is heavily involved. He's also the fellow of Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, fellow and vice president of the European Association for Artificial Intelligence. He is also a fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, and he's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Artificial Intelligence Research, and finally, the leader of the Vision Coordination Mandate of European Networks of Centers of Excellence in AI. So you can see that he has this vision for Europe, and the floor is yours, Holger, to share it and what can AI for the common good in Europe mean. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thanks also to Stefaan and Aimee for wonderful talks, which will be difficult to follow up on, but I'll try my best. And thanks to everybody else for being here for what is a great day for FARI, and by extension, of course, also a great day for Brussels, Belgium, and the European Union. So today, I'd like to share with you some thoughts on AI for the common good, because that's a topic that FARI has in common with the larger CLAIR organization, of which it is part. And let me just share my slides here with you and then get started with that. And the starting point actually is news that I saw just a few days ago from Vancouver, a beautiful place on the other side of the world where I lived for 20 years and where most of my academic training and career took place. And so for those of you who've been to Vancouver, you know that this is a wonderfully beautiful place. It's also a place where for years people, and actually, you know, all the way to the city council, people have been very, very, they have been very concerned with environmental issues. Now it turns out that Vancouver and the province of British Columbia, where it is situated, have suffered over the last 12 months a truly astounding series of climate extremes, starting from, you know, a heat wave in the summer that basically shattered all records for the province of British Columbia, and then followed by this storm, followed by a cold snap. So they've truly been battered. And that in a place that really took great care and has created great awareness. And of course, there are places in the world that are much worse hit than Vancouver. In fact, Aimee has said it in her talk, the world is in a pretty precarious state. This is an unusual view of our globe, sort of from the top right onto the North Pole. And what you can see there is the ice cap covering less and less of the Arctic Ocean. And that is truly a very big concern. So we live in troubled times with many global problems. The environment, climate change, biodiversity, and many other issues. Health, of course, at the forefront right now, the pandemic, but also unequal access to healthcare and the exploding cost thereof is a real problem. And then, of course, there are many societal problems, starting from inequity and the kind of conditions that Aimee exposed rather impressively, all the way to misinformation and political instability in an increasing number of regions in the world that are resulting from that. And so the question that we have to ask is, how did we get there? And we got there because our human intelligence has proven to be strong enough to transform our environment on a global scale. We're the only species on the planet that has managed to do that. And for what we know right now, this could of course change as we learn more about the universe around us. We may very well be the only species in the universe that has transformed an entire planet. And that, of course, is a critical ability, particularly if we take into account that also our intelligence appears to be too limited to truly understand the complex systems that we're messing with, the ones that we are part of as our natural environment, but also the ones that we build on top of that. And now the issue here, of course, is to a large degree not just limitations of our own processing capabilities, but also built-in biases, evolutionarily created and reinforced biases. And very simplistically speaking, I would characterize these, and I think this is well aligned with psychological findings, as we have a bias towards short-term, short-range, direct and linear effects of our actions or inaction. And that doesn't serve us well in the world that we live in now. So how do we overcome these limitations and this bias? Well, you know, the consequences of these limitations and these biases are not necessarily altogether new. And of course, humanity's first response to that has been to bet on collective intelligence and experience. And that wasn't so much a conscious bet as much as it was an evolutionary advantage. It led to essentially a cultural evolution where those who were better at collectively developing intelligence and sharing their experience started to have a competitive advantage. But this has also come to its limit. And now, of course, another way has emerged, and that is AI. And that is to basically create technology to help us overcome our cognitive limitations and biases. And in order to talk about that technology, it is useful to reflect just for a second what human intelligence actually is, or rather involves. And of course, we don't know this for sure, but what we do know is that key to our intelligence is the ability to learn from our mistakes and from our successes. And also, we learn by observing others and the environment. But that's not enough, because if we had to learn everything that we need in order to do well, we wouldn't be nearly as successful as we are in shaping our environment, understanding our environment, and ultimately taking advantage of it. What we also have cultivated very strongly, and what gives us a real edge, is the ability to reason, and particularly the ability to reason about things that we have never experienced and that maybe, hopefully, we will never experience. And so those two things really have to go in tandem in order to obtain something that we could call intelligence. And so it is with artificial intelligence. That also needs machine learning, which of course is based on data, but it also needs automated reasoning that essentially processes the kinds of insights and the kind of abstract representations that we can form, for example, through learning. In Europe, we often talk about human-centered AI, and there's a good reason for that, because that's the notion of artificial intelligence that augments rather than attempting to replace human intelligence. And I don't think I have to explain why this is an attractive idea, although we will get back to it in a moment. But the key idea, of course, is to use this machine intelligence truly to overcome human weaknesses and limitations rather than to just replicate them in a sort of machine slave scenario. So understandably, this is a large focus of the European push on AI. It is also, of course, at the focus of the CLARE initiative for European excellence in AI, and as we've heard today, is a focus for FARI. It resonates very well with other big players, such as Mila, one of the world's leading AI laboratories in Montreal, Stanford University, and many others. So CLARE has embraced quite a while ago the notion of AI for good, which can be defined as AI in pursuit or in aid of reaching the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as symbolized here, and the closely related notion of AI for all. And that notion is that it's AI that really tries to bring benefits broadly to society rather than just to a select few. And at this point, I think it's good to pause for a second and reflect, maybe in a simplistic way, but nonetheless, about the difference between what I call AI for profit and AI for good. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't want to say that AI for profit is bad, right? It's not the case that profit is per se a bad thing. But if you do something for profit with a capital P, that has consequences, and it's very important to be aware of the consequences and limitations that come out of that. So for example, if you do things for profit, including AI, that very often induces a focus on short-term versus long-term benefit. And the reason for that is that it's very difficult to quantify benefits over the long term, whereas it's typically much easier to do this on the short term. And because profit very often is something that requires to be quantified and is very much motivated by quantification, by amounts of money, this short-term benefit outweighs the long-term cost or benefit often. Also, AI for profit, of course, very much tends to be focused on replacing human capabilities and expertise, because human labor and human expertise, especially human expertise, is expensive, right? And that means if you can replace it, you can save cost and you can scale things up a lot better. AI for profit also very often is narrowly focused on performance, just getting that little bit of extra accuracy in a machine learning classifier versus robustness. And the reason for that is that, especially in the short term, higher performance can really increase your bottom line quite nicely, whereas better robustness might only pay off in the rare event of something truly unforeseen happening, a black swan type of event. And these, again, are difficult to predict and difficult to quantify and difficult to price in. AI for profit very often leverages uniformity, right? One mechanism to scale to as large a population or as large as a segment of the market as possible versus the diversity that AI for good requires. And often, but not always, that also induces sort of a global bias of AI for profit versus a more local focus, as also mentioned by Stefaan, on AI for good. Because many problems, although they're global problems, societal problems, they actually have to be addressed, at least to some extent, at the local level rather than at the global level. Whereas once you can scale things to up to the global level, truly mind-blowing benefits and profits can often be made versus just focusing on local issues. And finally, there is the issue of value versus values. And just to be very precise here, what I mean by that is shareholder value, which in Europe, thankfully, is not the main driving principle behind business. In the United States, for example, it is, versus value to society. And Aimee, of course, posed a very important question here, which is, the value to which society, right? And there, of course, we have a little bit of an issue if we talk about doing this at the European scale, because certainly we don't want to do this here for the benefit of European societies at the cost of societies elsewhere. Okay, and finally, looking at this, I do want to point out also that AI for good is not really just AI for specific applications where you would say, we do AI for profit and then we apply it in to certain application domains. That's not the case at all. As you can see from this juxtaposition here, the very premise of AI for good is rather different. And so therefore, very much like ethical AI, this has to be built from the ground up. Okay, here is once again the planet in this intriguing north on top view. And one of the things that we can look at in order to exemplify perhaps what AI for good can bring us and what concretely it could do is in the area of understanding better the environment that we are having so big an impact on. And as it turns out, Europe is a world leader in Earth observation. To be more specific, the European Space Agency and the many partners it's working with, academic and commercial partners, they have world-leading expertise in this. And what you can see here is a snapshot taken from the Copernicus Sentinel-2 satellite that illustrates that now actually, even as transient phenomena as today's wildfire situation, here in this case in South America, can actually be tracked in not quite real time, but at a great spatial and temporal resolution. And that, of course, has profound impact. So AI for Earth observation is a very exciting direction. My group in Leiden is majorly involved in that. And what you might think is, well, let's just take the very best image analysis and object recognition to the task, and surely then we can do amazing things. And that's in part true, but that's not where it should stop. Because in reality, the next big step forward in AI for Earth observation is to enhance the physical models that you use for Earth observation using AI techniques such as machine learning and optimization. And that is something where really you have to work very closely together, where you no longer just have a simple application, but where the physics that is specific to Earth observation comes in very close contact to fundamental methodological questions in AI. Now, if you can do this, this will certainly lead to an improved understanding of our natural environment. And that is the basis for dealing with it more responsibly. And that is precisely why there is a major European Union and ESA effort now on what's called Digital Twin Earth, which precisely tries to achieve that. So I want to go to now switch gears and get to a different topic. A second example, if you wish, and I think it's nicely encapsulated by this quote here from a news article about 2 years, now almost 3 years ago, but it's still very much a thing that should concern us. And this is actually an article written by Patricia Herdman, who is a software engineer, and she says, "I question the safety of self-driving cars as a professional software tester." And what she essentially says is that the technology that we create is so complex that even experts like her have no real possibility to make sure it always works correctly and in a responsible way. And so here comes an idea that I've started to pursue with my group in Leiden, but that is now at the core of the Alexander von Humboldt chair that I just took earlier this month in Aachen, namely to use AI, and what I mean by that is specifically developed AI techniques for this purpose in order to help us construct and use AI systems more responsibly and more effectively. And this is what I call automated artificial intelligence. So for those of you who've heard about AutoML, which is a big deal these days, because it basically takes a lot of the expert and guesswork out of making an ML system perform robustly and well. If you can take that and automate it, then you get AutoML. And if you do the same thing for a broader range of AI techniques as we should, then you get to AutoAI. And the idea there is, of course, to leverage in a significant way learning, optimization, and meta-algorithmic approaches. So this is quite foundational, quite challenging work, but it's worth doing because ultimately it helps us to reduce the barrier to building, deploying, and maintaining high-quality AI systems, the ones that currently only relatively few people, companies, or public organizations can build, with the goal of making them more predictable, more robust, and also more performant. That helps us to alleviate a very critical talent bottleneck that we are facing here in the EU and elsewhere, which basically says there aren't enough people to satisfy the demand for AI expertise. And as a result, sort of underqualified people are building, maintaining, deploying, and monitoring AI systems. And that, of course, has rather negative consequences. It also helps to make access to AI broader and to democratize the use of AI. Furthermore, this can give, if used rightly, increased benefits, including a smaller environmental footprint, both in terms of energy, CO2, and so on, as well as in terms of the rare minerals that Aimee mentioned, because essentially, if you can achieve similar quality results with less computation, you need less computers and less energy. And also, it can help to reduce the risk from AI. And thus, of course, it has major benefits for AI for good and for AI for all. So my final point is that AI is something that not only we should be concerned about, and that can help us if we use it right to basically overcome some of the messes that we've been making due to our own limitations, but also AI is something that can really inspire, unify, and connect. And the role of AI in that regard goes way further than that of mathematics in the 1800s and physics in the 1900s, because AI is about the automation of extracting knowledge from data, about deep reasoning over vast amount of knowledge. And that is exactly what's at the very foundation of the science and the engineering that we've been doing. Now, this has an increasing impact in all fields of knowledge, including the ones that look at science and engineering from the meta level and ask themselves, what are we actually doing that and how can we do it better and maybe for the common good, whatever exactly that is. Also, AI has a large number of inherent ethical, legal, and societal aspects that touch us all. The same could be said, of course, for mathematics and physics, but in AI, it becomes more tangible because the systems that we build more immediately touch people and people's lives. And AI finally has this potential to help us solve the grand challenges, but that only works if we have the right kind of AI driven by the right kind of values, the right kind of shared values. So this is our home. There's only one of them. Elon Musk might be very excited about going to Mars. I am actually too. I'm sure it's a fascinating place that we should learn a lot more about. But it also is a kind of hell, actually, where nobody wants to really live other than some fearless explorers. Whereas this is a home that has served us well and has been quite comfortable for the human species and for our cultural evolution for a very long time. And it's in all of our interest to keep it that way. And AI can help us, and AI should help us achieve this. So here's my take-home message. I strongly believe that human weaknesses and human limitations, some of them a result of the evolutionary process that produced us as individuals, as biological entities, but also as societies, they are at the root of most common problems. I firmly believe that AI is not the solution to those, but it is a major part of solutions to those. And in order to make this happen, we need to develop and use AI that augments and extends human intelligence rather than trying to replace it. I think we're right now in this moment facing a crucial choice between focusing our efforts, our energy on AI for profit or AI for good. I think this is a rather fundamental choice, and we cannot blame businesses for largely choosing AI for profit, because this is what many businesses are inherently about. That's natural. But this must be counterbalanced by a great push for AI for good that is coming out of the public sector, is coming out of the universities, out of the institutions that actually are responsible to the public and are paid for by the public. We need to make that choice. AI for good and AI for all has to be built up from the ground up. It's not something we can bolt on. We can't do AI research sort of in a value neutral way and then bolt on AI for good or apply it for good or for all. That's not the way it works. And Europe can and certainly should lead in this, but we need to act now. And that requires a swift and bold investment in core AI, which at the European level, unfortunately, is not happening, still not happening after talking about it for 4 years almost. And it needs strong links with other disciplines in public and the public interest. It's great to see initiatives like FARI getting off the ground. It's great to see the Belgian government committing as it does to this, but we need more. We need to see this happen all around Europe, and we need the Commission, Council, and the European Parliament to get behind this in a way that currently isn't happening yet. Then and only then can we leverage truly AI for the common good, for the good of Europe, and for the good of the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holger, for your very inspiring presentation. I now invite Hugues and Bersini and Anne-Noé to also open their mic. I will start with one question from Wolfgang Bibel to kickstart 5 minutes of questions followed by the panel. The excellent presentations by the 3 AI experts, but also by the distinguished honorable representatives, have rightly pointed out the breadth and importance of AI as a discipline. With its wide range of important application, it has become of greatest relevance for the entire society. Unfortunately, this relevance is not reflected at all by AI's role as a discipline in comparison to disciplines like math, physics, biology. Take school education as an example. I know of no regular subject in schools at any level which fully represent AI in some way or another. How could we build a digital society, as called by State Secretary Mathieu Michel in this event, without the strong participation of institutions such as regular schools in their standard education? Any ideas on the side of speakers on how to change that unfortunate situation? So I'm looking out now at the presenters and also the panelists, but because I think this is a broad question, who is maybe a lead on that or want to share an idea on how to answer Wolfgang?
So I can just kick us off and get us started. Again, I come from the humanities, from the ethics space, so I'm not teaching in the technical discipline, so I would pass the baton to Holger for that. But what I would say is added to this, so not only is this a question of learning the technical skills of the technology, but we also need students to have more ethics training. more sort of reflection on the kinds of things that they are making in class and doing in class, and then being critical of what it is that they're learning. I have a background in cell biology, and so I remember it very clearly that, you know, you learn, you think in the box, and you don't ask questions. And so then moving into the ethics space allows us to teach the students new ways of looking at problems. And yeah, and I think that's necessary when we're talking about these technologies.
Thank you. For the others, any thoughts on that? All right, so then I will maybe...
I think Holger's hand is up,
go ahead.
actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe briefly, I agree with Aimee, of course, but I would also say it all starts with creating early awareness, right? And early awareness here, I think, means really two things. It means that as early as grade 5, 6, 7, I think we should start teaching kids at school mandatorily about the limitations of human intelligence and thinking, right? I mean, we teach them how to do certain things that require intelligence, but we rarely teach them the limitations of this. I think it's very important for them from an early age to be very aware of the fallacies of human thinking and human reasoning. And at the same time, I think we should teach them about how machines can be used to overcome at least some of this. And that is the way I believe we should introduce AI as the broad discipline that Wolfgang has in mind to young people before we go into the technical matters, right? The technical matters then also need to follow, but there, unfortunately, AI is more complex than, you know, reading, writing, and doing simple calculations. They are all the basis for doing AI, so we have to do that first. But these limitations and quirks of human reasonings, and also, you know, ways of machine reasoning, the idea of what is an algorithm, what can it be used for, what should it be used for, where does it have problems? I think actually kindergarten kids can start to understand this, and they should.
Thank you. Stefaan?
Yeah, no, obviously I agree with both Aimee and Holger, but I think in our work, what we've seen is not only the need for increased education in AI, but actually the development of new kinds of bilinguals. People that have a domain expertise and an expertise in data and AI, because it turns out that actually those bilinguals are going to be the ones that really can understand both the limitations, the opportunities, and the challenges within a particular kind of field. And absent those kinds of bilinguals, it's going to be very hard to leave it up to the AI experts or have the domain experts identify opportunities where AI could make a difference. And I think it's that kind of new bilingualism that we actually need across all disciplines. And I think that's where I would advocate for really investment in that kind of education.
Thank you very much. So for timing's sake, I saw some very interesting questions. Sadly, we will move to the panel. So I have the pleasure of introducing Hugues Bersini and Professor Aimee. Hugues Bersini is the director of Iridia at the Free University of Brussels, Université Libre de Bruxelles. He's one of the scientific leads of FARI and has been very involved in thinking of how AI could be useful to society as a whole. Professor Aimee is the director of the AI lab at the VUB, Vrije University of Brussels, and she's heavily involved also in both fundamental research projects, but also thinking of how could AI be used for many topics such as energy consumption, for instance. So the first question to kickstart this little panel discussion is, as has been shared during this event, cities and public administrations are fascinating starting points to think of AI and the common good. Many of the issues raised by Aimee, Holger, Stefaan are usually also taking place within entities such as cities. So in your experience, what are the key ingredients for an optimal collaboration between public authorities and researchers in AI, data, and robotics? So I will start with you, Anne. Do you have any thoughts on how and what should be put in place to optimize the collaboration between the experts and the cities?
Okay, thank you for inviting me on this panel. And I think I will take a bit the answer of the remark of Stefaan for this. I think it's indeed very important to talk the same language, and I'm not talking here about Dutch or French, but trying to understand each other. But, and I think Holger will confirm this, this is like lecture number 1 in AI, and we seem to forget this. When I was studying AI, the first lecture was on how to interview the expert, how to talk to the expert, how to figure out what the user wants. And since these were expert systems, it was what is the need of the expert. And I think we are forgetting this. I think also in education, I guess we stress too much. It's about getting the data. No, it's about understanding what the problem we actually want to solve. And nevertheless, I do this normally. I think I forget to tell it to the students. So when a company or another organization is asking me about solving a problem, I insist that I can go to their location. I can see how people are working right now. What are they looking at? What are they talking about? So that I better understand what is going on. And this is not about sending me gigabytes of data and then say to me, figure out which patterns are there. No, and that also links to what Holger was saying in his presentation. It's not about, not only about the data, there's so much knowledge that we should capture. And then that links back to Aimee's talk, because if we do that, we can make things so much energy efficient, much more energy efficient. And I think it's a complex thing. And one important task, I think also for Fari, is to not hide this complexity. If you want to do it in a good way, it takes effort to come up with a good AI solution.
Thank you. Hugues, I will also let you the floor. What do you think are the key ingredients following also Anne's remarks?
Yeah, first, I'd like to thank the very 3 inspiring talks. I love most of what I've said, what I've heard, and I've taken a lot of notes. And well, your question is basically the reason d'être of Fari, and one of the reasons why Fari has been created, and why is that being created at a very local level. In fact, many items of the different talks we heard was about the localism versus globalism. And I really wanted Fari to be very local in Brussels. But as you know, Belgium is a very complicated country, so there's a lot of things that have been decided to be local due to the Belgian political situation. But most of it, I guess that it was interesting to create Fari at a very local level, because then you had the opportunity to interact with really the public administration, because I believe that the only way to implement AI software for the public good, at least I think we all have the same experience, perhaps in different countries, is to be forced to interact, to get into the public administration. And then you realize that public administration are state into states. They are very difficult to interact with. One of the reasons, and that to some extent it connects with a part of the talk of Holger about this AI for profit and AI for good, is that you realize, and I really apologize for if there are members of public administration here, but that there is a lack of competence in AI and in software in general in public administrations. And I would say that maybe because most of the good software engineer or software researcher, they're not so much interested in working in public administration, because if they want to make a very sophisticated algorithm, very nice research, it would be on the academic side. And if they want to make money, they would rather go on the private sector. So then they just desert the public administration. So you have to interact with a lot of people in public administration which are very conservative and very prudent about AI. And this is the reason most of the time why we do interact with private companies. And then you realize that, and it's a pity, because I think the best interlocutor for dealing with public services in case they want to develop software for doing those things, this is the experience I had in different use cases that I've played with, like mobility. We heard a lot in the Stefaan talks. And most of the example you gave are some equivalent in Brussels, what we're trying to push. In fact, there is an interesting algorithm running in Brussels for access to schools, as you know. In fact, this algorithm was inspired by a similar algorithm in New York and in Boston. But we also, as you know, we also work on mobility. We were a lot involved in the campaign of vaccination. Then we realized that in all cases, we had to interact with public administration. And we realized that most of the time, because they don't have internal competence, they outsource their software problems and they outsource it to private companies. And then you realize that the private companies, they don't have a public good in their DNA. You know, they want efficiency, they want to make profit, they want money. So they're losing the real public goods that the public administration should care for. So there is a kind of paradox taking place there.
Hugues, sorry,
yeah.
I see that Holger wants to react to what you're saying. So please, Holger, and also the others, if you have comments, please feel free.
Oh, sorry, Hugues, I didn't want to cut you off. I very much enjoyed listening to what you were saying. I just got very excited about the direction you were taking, because I think you're hitting the nail right on the head. I think one of the big problems of one of the big consequences of what I call the talent bottleneck is that, you know, most people who are really good in AI, they have plenty of options to choose from. And of course, private industry often has the most attractive options. That must change.
Yeah.
It is absolutely crucial because of this, and I think this is a real dichotomy, not a false one, between AI for profit and AI for good. It is okay if public administration outsources some of the AI work and algorithms work, but not to private industry. They can outsource it to government organization, to universities, to things that are beholden to the common good, right? That also make things open. And we see a fair number of very encouraging initiatives around Europe, right? There is this, I always forget what it's called, but I'm sure there are people who know more about it than I do. There is this sort of organization where European cities talk to each other. This is absolutely wonderful. What they should do is they should say, we create for this organization 5 AI positions that are really highly paid, and we're committing that all the great data that's coming in from the European cities does not go to commercial purposes. It goes first to that team. So now that team has the salary, has the working condition, has the data, has the problems, right? They can do great things, right? That, in my opinion, is what needs to happen. But public administration, government, they need to swallow the toad that this is a competitive market. They need to compete for the talent. However, in AI, I think it's worth competing for the talent, because true progress in AI in the public sector as well pays for itself. Not because it replaces people, but for instance, because it can help a city actually save cost, right? Save environmental footprint. And therefore, I think it should be easy to find that money, which will pay off easily for itself for good AI experts that work for the common good at public institutions.
Thank you. Thank you. Aimee, you wanted to react, and then Stefaan?
Sure. Actually, I just wanted to kind of take up the same idea and then steer it. So love that point, by the way, Holger. I don't know why we haven't been talking about that earlier, about the funding of these positions. It's a fantastic idea. But then maybe to get at what I think is the underlying sort of theme that we're talking about is also power. The power in the relationship. So everybody wants to work with industry. I'm at an academic institution, but industry is where, you know, we have CPUs, not GPUs, our servers. And so I want to run some tests, but of course I really want to do this with a tech company, or at least a company who has a much better infrastructure than I do. And the problem is that the power is such that they can ask anything of me in terms of signing an NDA, right? In terms of, you know, if I were to ever accept money, then everything becomes tainted and whatnot. So I think that in terms of your first question, which was what makes a good collaboration, it's having this balance of power. And then I think this goes back to Holger's point. We have to rethink the amount and the kind of power that tech companies, or just companies in general, have. And they get to decide who they share their data with, under what conditions. They get to decide who they share their infrastructure with, and under what conditions. So just adding to the point, and maybe kind of like, yeah, adding a new flavor to it.
Thank you. Stefaan, that's also right in your alley in terms of expertise.
Yeah, but I do want to pick up where Anne also went to, which is the real essential skill of problem definition, and I do believe that that's quite often assumed that everyone has, but it's essentially a skill that we need to invest in more and more. I mean, here at GovLab, we have something called the GovLab Academy, where we work with city innovation, what we call public entrepreneurs. And in order for them to join the academy, we always ask them, anyway, define the problem that you want to work on. And most of them, if not all, come up with solutions, but not with the problem that they actually want to address. And so we've invested a lot in that problem definition methodology, including in the data space and in the AI space, where quite often it's very hard to even formulate the questions that they seek to answer, or the kinds of applications for which AI needs to be developed, which is why we, at least I have called upon, instead of data literacy, we need questions literacy. We need actually a capability to formulate questions that subsequently we can seek to answer. And so that's something that we need to invest in. And there's also quite often a cultural aspect. I mean, many public administrations, frankly, have not permission to acknowledge that they have problems with others in the room. And so it's really a culture of learning and a culture of experimentation that we need to establish. And I totally agree with Hughes, is that it's gonna have to be something that you develop together. And so it's you're gonna have to go into the administrations in order to help them, but also to learn from them on what are possible opportunities as well. Now, coming back to Holger and the other things, you know, as I mentioned, procurement is a big problem that stands in the way of all the aspects that we are talking about as well, including procuring or even developing a partnership with universities, which quite often can be problematic as well. And so investing in that kind of relationship management is going to be a big solution as well.
Thank you. One other question to sort of end also this panel is that it has also been talked a lot about the fact that accessing good quality data or information is a prerequisite to do a lot of viable AI projects. It's a narrative that we hear, and it's also a need that has been expressed by many people working in AI. If we want more AI for the common good, does that mean that we should predominantly push for more and more data? Or are there any other needs or steps to take in order to push the idea from the common good, also from a technical perspective? So does anyone have maybe a thought on that? Yes, Hugues, please.
I might, because I was very happy to hear in Holger's talk to reestablish the balance between the AI which resonates and the AI that learns. In fact, there is an evolution in AI these last 10 years that I deeply regret. To some extent, for myself, is a kind of regression in AI, is this, you know, this success of deep learning and machine learning, where more and more there are a lot of people in AI that believe that we have to discard human intelligence from the, you know, AI algorithm, which is really what happened with deep learning, which according to me is a kind of regression. And that explains to some extent the reason why we have to consume 5 cars of gasoline in order to train a deep learner, because I would say that most of the time, a much simpler algorithm with a lot of much reasoning and human expertise could do, you know, language translation or. And so this is something that, because you were asking, Carl, do we need a lot of data or do we need a lot of information? I think you can take information out of human brain. That is the best way of still, I think, doing AI, but just extracting data from the reality. Chomsky made a very nice point on that. You know, physics is based on information and a little bit on data, but a lot on human knowledge and human competence. And by the way, I would finish on that. Most of the algorithms that I have developed for Brussels these days and that Paris are developing, like the algorithm for vaccination, the algorithm for mobility, the algorithm for school access, has nothing to do with machine learning. There's just, for instance, the L-Shapley algorithm for school access, A-star algorithm for mobility. So the old-fashioned AI has still a lot to do for, you know, our common goods. And it's easier to define what are the common goods in a classical algorithm than it is in the machine learning, much more difficult in machine learning.
Thank you, Hugues. Any other thoughts on that? What would be needed in order to push or support the idea of AI for the common good, specifically in a local context? What would be needed? Probably.
Well, maybe one
yes,
quick
please.
comment on this. I do think, you know, knowing a little bit about FARI, that one of the very wise decisions that has been made, and I think we start to see this mirrored in other places that truly care about AI for good, is to approach this methodologically, not in a narrow way, right? So if you look at world-leading institutions that have written this on their banner, they very rarely commit to just deep learning, right? I think they are problem-driven. They take the attitude that There are problems that we need to understand, and then we throw at these problems whatever we can, right? Ideally, a combination of human insight and machine intelligence. And I do think that this is immensely important, to not be narrowly methodologically limited to one range of techniques that happens to be on vogue right now. You will not catch me saying anything really bad about deep learning, because I think it's actually very impressive what has been achieved. And I do think that it truly broadens what we can do. But where I draw the boundary is where we start to discard other methods in favor of what seems sometimes almost like a religious belief, right? No, we should use these methods when they're appropriate, and we should use other methods when those are more appropriate, and we should train people that have a good methodological arsenal and overview that can bring and have been trained to bring the right tool to the job. And also to not think that now we have deep learning, we have the last tool we'll ever need. I mean, the history of AI, in fact, the history of science teaches us that this kind of conviction is almost certainly always false, right? So I'm sure there will be a next revolution in AI beyond deep learning. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what that is. Meanwhile, of course, let's use deep learning for everything for which it's good, and let's use other techniques for the things that they're better for.
Thank you. So I will ask Stefaan and Aimee, then a final word to Anne in 2 or 3 sentences. I'm sorry, to be mindful of time, and let Hans present the next steps. Thank you. Stefaan, please.
Yeah, I just also want to pick up where Aimee talked about power asymmetries. And I think part of the power asymmetries is also a result of data asymmetries, i.e. some have access to data, some don't have access to data. And so from my point of view, within the context of FARI, a key element is going to be how do you tackle with those data asymmetries. This is not about collecting more data. It's really about how do we actually have access to data that has already been collected, and can we start reusing for public interest objectives. And I think that has been, especially within cities, a key opportunity, but also a key challenge. And that's where, anyway, as you know, I've been advocating for creating of data collaboratives, where you actually have and provide access to data that already has been collected in the city, start using it for the city as opposed to hoarding it and starting using it, for instance, in an asymmetric way to generate intelligence that might actually not serve the public interest. And I think that's a key concern, that, again, cities can become leaders in developing those data collaboratives, where we then actually have access to data that could benefit citizens, as opposed to have, anyway, those kinds of data monopolies that ultimately don't really provide any public benefit as well. So that's, if you ask Carl, what is another area where we could make a difference at city level, that's one of them.
Thank you. So maybe Aimee in 1 sentence, and then and maybe
1 sentence. Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. So picking up on the question, like what can we do to achieve this idea of AI for the common good? So what I would suggest is, what I was picking up on is this lack of knowledge that we have about the environmental consequences. So if you are developing AI algorithms, there are carbon trackers available, right? So why not have that as an added layer in all of the research that you're doing? Measure the carbon emissions when you're training, when you're using. I'm just about to enter into partnerships with a technical company and with academic institutions where we're going to try and work this out. So I would be happy to have a conversation about how we could do this to generate the numbers so that we can provide information to policymakers, so we understand if at any point there needs to be a cap in terms of, right, you can only train on a certain number of GPUs for a certain amount of time. Anyway, so it's starting to address the environmental costs so that you're looking at the good of all of the people in Brussels as well, right? You don't want to exacerbate environmental consequences as well as the global community. That was a long sentence, sorry.
No, thank you. Anne, and then Hans.
At some point, I would definitely like to discuss with Aimee on this issue and my point of view on this. But if you want my 1 sentence, I would say that FARI is for me an ideal environment to discuss very interdisciplinary, and so not only about different AI techniques, but all these different points of view, and also to discover where we seem not to really understand each other. And that this often leads to what I then call this biased talks about bias in AI. And I think that should also well, by talking to each other, I think we all should try to avoid this because it's also very important that we inform the community in a correct way. And that's also for the AI researchers, because I also learn a lot from some of my messages that are getting misunderstood, and to do it better next time, because I'm, after all, a reinforcement learner, so I learn also from my failures. So that's my short statement.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the presenters. Hans, the floor is yours to give the final words and let everybody know about the future actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. And I'm just quickly going to share some of the concrete actions indeed that we were able to execute thanks to the Next Gen Europe and Resilience Fund program to make some of these suggestions maybe also come to the real life. And indeed, as we already have heard, it is really a focus of FARI to bridge that gap through civic outreach and really include citizens in the different actions that we're going to take, and that multidisciplinary, maybe complex approach to service and to provide services to not only citizens, but also public administration and companies that want to work together with this public administration is going to be brought in place. And as such, we will help the administration in their transition. And in order to do so, it is really crucial that we actually help the Brussels capital region on their AI strategy by, for example, also developing this education hub and test and experience hub. And more importantly, of course, also for us as academics, new research and innovation programs. Maybe for the audience still to know is that FARI exists out of 5 core research groups from the ULB and 5 core research groups from the VUB, from really different scientific fields, from real pure AI research and computer science to law and social science. And we actually capture as such expertise in Brussels of over 300 researchers that are working and doing research on AI, data and robotics, fundamental research, but also applications in AI, data and robotics. So it's about these 10 core research groups that we actually built the nucleus, and that we're going to really focus on research and innovation, but also really want to reach out to society by really societal initiatives and actually bring into place a infrastructure, a test and experience hub to make that work. And in the Relance and Resilience Fund program, I'm going to quickly give you just a high-level overview in the timing, what to expect the upcoming 3 years. And it is that thanks to the funding, there will be an establishment of new research and innovation programs. An internal joint PhD program for these 10 core research groups. And at the other hand, also a new collaborative research program with the collaboration of Innoveris to collaborate in a multidisciplinary way, also with profit and non-for-profit organizations in the Brussels capital region. As said earlier, also an AI academy will be developed, different types of training programs to different types of audiences, both profit and non-for-profit are targeted. We also will support already existing training organizations to actually make sure that they have a state-of-the-art training on the actual insights, not only technically from AI, data and robotics, but also the ethical and societal aspects of it. And also we will develop a postgraduate program as from next year onwards. We will have this experience hub starting, it's not only about an infrastructure, but also have high qualified experts in place that can help with tools and proof of concepts and bring them actually to reality, and actually also to the audience to show and tell what the capabilities of AI are. And we will also, of course, reach out to not only Europe, but also to the economic ecosystem. We have a specific entrepreneurship support program where we want to reach out to at least 20 startups in the Brussels capital region. The other big part of the reference will be spent to the support of public administration. We are developing now 4 pilot projects during the year of 2022, but we also develop a specific smart city support to really on policy level, but also on a technical level, be able to support public administration in developing these open AI toolboxes for applications in the public administration. And apart from that, of course, also make sure that we have a multidisciplinary team in place that can give support on AI ethics and answer questions to citizens, make sure that we can organize citizen deliberation, have answers to equality, diversity, and equality programs in the near future. We'll also set up 1 to 2 citizen science projects also in the year of 2023. So this at a high level and a glance, an insight of what to expect if you're working, living in Brussels. If you want to collaborate in some of these experts, I would say, please reach out to us. Of course, also on the research level, and it's of course also the ambition of us to make that work with the panel that we had today and the keynote speakers. I hope that we can collaborate also on this ambition of FARI. And I would say especially to you, many thanks for your time. Making yourself available this afternoon means a lot for us. And we hope to collaborate on some of these projects in the near future and hope to see you soon. So I think with this, we're only going a little bit over time, but many thanks to the audience to be present, and I hope to see you all in the near future.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Hans. Thanks, Carl. Nice to see you,
Bye.
Holger.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your new position.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Yeah, we'll see you soon. Bye.
Great event, Hans and Carl, by the way.
Yeah, well done.
All the best of success for you.
All right.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your time and very interesting presentations. Thank you.